He walked into that courtroom with a $900 an hour attorney, a custom charcoal suit, and 14 years of certainty that she had nothing. She walked in with a manila folder, a black pen, and a composure so complete it looked almost careless. He had spent 3 years making sure of it, draining the joint accounts down to vapor, changing the locks while she was at her mother's, pulling the children close and whispering things about her no mother should ever have to answer for. He had told his partners, his golf circle, his country club crowd, that she had simply fallen apart, that she couldn't handle the life he had built, that he had done everything he could. And standing there alone at the respondents' table, her blazer pressed carefully that morning, her heels quiet against the marble floor, Renata looked exactly like the woman he needed everyone to see. Struggling. Ordinary. Finished. That was the last accurate assumption DeShawn Carter would ever make about his wife. Because what DeShawn didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he had stopped paying attention to her the moment he decided she no longer fit the image he was building, was that while he was constructing his case against her, Renata had been constructing something else entirely. Something patient, something documented, something that couldn't be frozen, changed, or taken in the night. And when Judge Miriam Okafor looked down at the folder Renata placed on that courtroom table, the silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was the sound of a very carefully laid trap closing shut. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what happened in Courtroom 7 of the Cook County Family Court on a cold Tuesday morning in February, you have to go back 14 years. You have to go back to the beginning, to the version of this story that looked, for a very long time, like a love story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. DeShawn Carter grew up in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago, the second of 4 children in a household that ran on discipline, ambition, and the kind of faith that doesn't ask questions. His father worked for the city. His mother taught 3rd grade for 26 years. They weren't wealthy, but they were intentional, and DeShawn absorbed that intentionality like water. By the time he graduated from the University of Illinois with a finance degree, he already knew exactly what kind of man he intended to become. The kind whose name appeared on buildings. The kind whose calls got returned on the first ring. The kind other men studied from across the room. He was 24 when he met Renata Monroe at a fundraiser for a Southside literacy initiative. She was there volunteering. He was there networking. She was wearing a green dress and arguing cheerfully with a city alderman about after-school funding, and DeShawn, who had walked in planning to shake 20 hands and leave in 40 minutes, stayed 3 hours. He found out later she hadn't noticed him at all until he sat down next to the alderman and said, quietly but clearly, that she was right. They dated for 2 years. They were careful, deliberate people who believed in knowing before committing. Renata was finishing her master's degree in social work at Loyola. DeShawn had just landed a junior analyst position at a mid-sized investment firm in the Loop. Their lives were parallel tracks moving in the same direction, and when DeShawn proposed on a Sunday morning in her apartment with a ring he had saved for across 11 months, she said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding was small. 40 people in a garden space in Hyde Park in September. Renata's mother cried through the entire ceremony. DeShawn's father shook his hand afterward and said only, "Take care of her." DeShawn said he would. He meant it then. The first years were good. Genuinely good in the way that early marriages can be before life adds weight to everything. They lived in a 2-bedroom in Evanston. Renata worked for a nonprofit serving foster youth on the Northwest Side. DeShawn moved up steadily at the firm, putting in the hours that junior analysts put in when they're hungry and the path is clear. They cooked together on Sundays. They argued about small things and resolved them. They were, by every visible measure, exactly what they appeared to be. Then DeShawn made director. Then managing director. Then, at 34, he was recruited to lead the Chicago office of Hargrove Capital, one of the most aggressive private equity firms operating in the Midwest. His compensation package that first year was just over $800,000. And something shifted. It didn't happen dramatically. It happened the way most fundamental changes happen inside a marriage, gradually, in increments too small to name until you're standing in the wreckage trying to remember when it started. The country club membership came first, then the new vehicle, then the move to a 4-bedroom home in Lincoln Park that cost $2.1 million and which Renata had serious reservations about, but ultimately agreed to because she loved him and he told her this was what they had worked for. The social calendar changed. The friends changed. The dinner conversations changed. DeShawn began spending his weekends with people who measured success in square footage and net worth, and Renata, who still drove twice a week to her nonprofit and still kept photos of her foster youth clients' milestones on the refrigerator, began to feel the distance forming between them like a hairline crack in good china. When their daughter Zora was born, Renata left her position at the nonprofit. Temporarily, they agreed. DeShawn's hours were brutal, and someone needed to be present. It made practical sense. Renata was organized, loving, capable. She would manage the household and the children, and when Zora was old enough for school, she would return to her career. That was the agreement. It seemed reasonable in the language of the moment. Their son Marcus arrived 22 months after Zora, and the temporary arrangement settled into something permanent, though neither of them said so. Renata became the architecture of their household. The school schedules and the pediatric appointments and the homework and the meals and the social obligations and the emotional climate of the home, all of it passed through her. She managed it with the same competence she brought to everything she touched. And DeShawn, climbing higher and moving faster, began to mistake that competence for invisibility. By the time Zora started second grade and Marcus was in kindergarten, Renata had been out of the formal workforce for 7 years. She had mentioned, more than once, that she wanted to return to something. Social work consulting, nonprofit board work, even a part-time role. Each time, DeShawn had redirected the conversation toward logistics. Who would handle school pickup? Who would manage the household staff they now employed? He never said no. He just made yes impossible. Renata noticed. She filed the noticing away in a place she didn't yet have a name for. The marriage began failing in the way that marriages fail when one person is living inside it and the other is using it as a backdrop. DeShawn's attention was elsewhere, at Hargrove Capital, where he was being positioned for a senior partnership, in social spaces that rewarded a certain image. And, Renata would learn later, in a relationship with a colleague named Simone that had been going on for 14 months before she found the messages on a Tuesday afternoon in April while DeShawn's phone was charging on the kitchen counter. She didn't confront him that day. This is one of the first things you need to understand about Renata Monroe Carter, something DeShawn consistently underestimated. She did not operate on impulse. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after she put the phone down. She made herself a cup of tea. She looked out the window at the backyard where her children would come home and play in 4 hours. And she thought carefully about what she was going to do next. She called her sister Delphine that evening, after the children were asleep. She told her everything. And Delphine, who was a paralegal at a family law firm in Cincinnati and who had seen what happened to women who acted without a plan, said 3 words that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. She said, "Don't move yet." Renata didn't move yet. Instead, she started paying attention. She began, quietly and methodically, to document bank statements, investment account statements, the names on accounts she had never been given full access to, DeShawn's business interests, partnerships, LLCs, equity positions in deals that Hargrove Capital had structured over the years. She photographed documents when he left them on his desk. She noted account numbers and balances. She created a folder on a personal laptop he didn't know she had, purchased with cash from the household grocery budget set aside over 4 months. She also called a woman named Patricia Osei, a family law attorney in Chicago with 19 years of experience and a reputation in Cook County courtrooms that preceded her significantly. Renata used her own savings, money she had slowly and deliberately moved into a personal account over the prior year, to retain Patricia on a quiet basis. No paperwork at the family address. No calls to the family phone. Patricia Osei became the most important person in Renata's life for the next 22 months, and DeShawn Carter had no idea she existed. Then, 8 months before the divorce filing, Renata did one more thing. Something DeShawn would not discover until she placed that folder on the courtroom table. Something that would reframe everything he thought he knew about the woman standing alone on the other side of that aisle. She enrolled in an online certification program in financial forensics. DeShawn filed first. This surprised Renata, though she didn't let it show. She had been preparing for the possibility, but she had expected more time. What she didn't know, what she would piece together later from financial records and depositions, was that DeShawn had been consulting his own attorney for nearly 6 months before he filed. Someone at the firm had apparently advised him that initiating first created a narrative advantage. That a man who filed was a man who took action, not a man who got caught. He filed on a Thursday in October. The petition cited irreconcilable differences. His attorney, a senior partner at one of Chicago's most prominent family law firms, had the paperwork served to Renata at the Lincoln Park home at 9 a.m. on a Friday morning, 2 hours after DeShawn had taken the children to school himself. A rare occurrence she now understood as strategic, ensuring she was alone when the papers arrived. She called Patricia immediately. Patricia had reviewed every document Renata had gathered over the prior year. She knew the accounts. She knew the asset structure. She knew about the LLC that held equity in 3 commercial real estate deals structured through Hargrove Capital, the one that wasn't listed on any joint financial disclosure. She knew about the investment account in DeShawn's name only, funded over 4 years with transfers from the joint account, now worth approximately $340,000. And she knew about something Renata had discovered 3 months earlier, a second phone, a prepaid one, that Renata had found in DeShawn's gym bag and returned exactly where she found it after photographing every screen she could access. Patricia said, "He doesn't know what we know, and we are going to let him believe that for as long as possible." DeShawn's attorney, whose name was Gerald Fitch, moved quickly. He filed motions requesting primary physical custody of Zora and Marcus, citing Renata's absence from the workforce and what he characterized as her emotional instability following the separation. He froze the joint accounts, pending disclosure. He filed a preliminary financial statement that listed DeShawn's assets with notable precision: the home, the primary investment accounts, the retirement funds, and with notable vagueness regarding the LLC and the secondary investment account. The omission wasn't accidental. Patricia spotted it within 20 minutes of receiving the document. She said nothing to Gerald Fitch about it. She simply noted it, added it to her file, and waited. Renata, meanwhile, moved into a rented apartment in the Bronzeville neighborhood, a 2-bedroom, modest, selected deliberately. Not the house she had managed for 11 years. Not the Lincoln Park address with the sub-zero refrigerator and the heated floors. 2 bedrooms, because her children needed a place to sleep when they were with her. She furnished it carefully, with pieces that were clean and warm and intentional. She hung Zora's drawings on the refrigerator. She set up Marcus's Legos on a low shelf in the 2nd bedroom. She made it a home in the quiet, capable way she made everything into what it needed to be. DeShawn told people she had walked away, that she had lost herself somehow, that he had tried. His partners' wives murmured sympathetically. His golf circle nodded. The version of events he was constructing required Renata to be diminished, so he diminished her in every room he entered. He had no idea she was in that Bronzeville apartment every weeknight after the children went to sleep, working through her financial forensics coursework, cross-referencing what she was learning against the documents she had spent a year gathering. She had a gift for pattern recognition that her social work training had sharpened. She could look at a transaction log and feel when something was missing. And the more she studied, the more she felt that what DeShawn had hidden was not just the LLC and the secondary account. There was something else, something further back, something structural. She brought her findings to Patricia in December, for months before the first court date. Patricia spread the documents across her conference table and called in her colleague, a forensic accountant named Renata, whose entire professional life was devoted to finding money that men like DeShawn Carter did not want found. Bernard looked at Renata's documents for 45 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "Where did you learn to do this?" Renata said, "I taught myself." Bernard looked at Patricia and said, "She's right about the transfers. And I think there's more." There was more. The first court date arrived on a Tuesday in February. The courtroom was on the 7th floor of the Daily Center, one of those civic spaces that carries the weight of decades of decisions in its air. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent light, softened by tall windows, the particular quiet of a place where things are decided. Renata arrived early. She sat at the respondent's table, her folder in front of her, her black pin resting across it. She wore a navy blazer and low heels. Her hair was natural, pulled back simply. She had chosen everything deliberately, not to impress, but to be unreadable, to take up exactly as much space as she needed and not 1 inch more. DeShawn arrived 7 minutes later with Gerald Fitch at his side. Gerald was a tall man in his mid-50s with the practiced ease of someone who had won enough courtroom arguments to stop being anxious about them. He carried a leather briefcase and spoke briefly to the bailiff with the familiarity of someone who considered this room his professional territory. DeShawn wore a dark suit, not quite as expensive as the Tom Ford he'd be wearing by the final hearing, but expensive enough to send a message. He scanned the room, registered Renata sitting alone, and something in his posture settled. He thought he understood what he was looking at. Judge Miriam Okafor entered at exactly 9 o'clock. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked natural hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had been on the Cook County Family Court bench for 16 years and carried the particular authority of someone who had heard every version of every story and learned to hear the truth in the spaces between what people said. She arranged her papers, looked out over the courtroom, and began without ceremony. She addressed Gerald first, reviewing the motions on the docket: primary custody, asset division, spousal support, or rather, DeShawn's petition arguing there should be none, on the grounds that Renata had been voluntarily out of the workforce and had demonstrably declined opportunities to re-enter it. Gerald articulated this last point with particular smoothness. The language he used was careful, even sympathetic. He spoke about Renata's challenges and difficulties with the kind of practiced concern that was designed to sound like compassion and function like a weapon. Judge Okafor turned to Renata. "Mrs. Carter, you are representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Renata said. "I'm proceeding pro se." DeShawn leaned toward Gerald and said something low and brief. Gerald allowed himself a small, composed smile. Judge Okafor's eyes moved to them, then back to Renata. "You filed a counter-motion requesting joint custody and equitable distribution of all marital assets. You're also disputing the characterization of your workforce participation in your husband's filing." "Yes, Your Honor." "Go ahead." Renata stood. She didn't look at DeShawn. She looked at the judge, and she spoke in the measured, organized way of someone who has rehearsed not her words, but her breathing. She said that for 14 years she had been the operational foundation of their household, that she had left her career not because she had no ambition, but because they had made a joint decision, one she had honored fully while continuing to grow in other ways. She said that since their separation she had been working, learning, and building, and that she was prepared to demonstrate this to the court's satisfaction. DeShawn's expression shifted slightly. Something uncertain moved behind his eyes for just a moment. Then he turned to Gerald, and the uncertainty resolved back into confidence. She had nothing. He knew she had nothing. He had made sure. Mrs. Carter, Judge Okafor said, your husband's filing suggests you have no current income and no professional credentials that would allow you to provide financial stability for your children. How do you respond to that characterization? Renata reached into her folder. She pulled out a document and walked it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. Then she returned to her table and stood quietly while Judge Okafor reviewed it. The judge's reading glasses went on. A silence extended across the courtroom. Gerald shifted slightly in his chair. DeShawn watched the judge's face for signals, found none, and looked back at Renata. She was looking at the window. Judge Okafor looked up. Mrs. Carter, this document indicates you recently completed a certification in financial forensics. Yes, Your Honor. And you're currently employed. Yes, Your Honor. I've been consulting independently for the past 8 months, providing financial analysis support to 3 family law firms in the Chicago area. My income over the past calendar year was $67,000. I also have an offer for a full-time position as a financial analyst with Meridian Advocacy Group, beginning next month. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one before it. DeShawn sat forward in his chair. Gerald put down his pen. Your Honor, DeShawn said, half rising, that's not possible. She hasn't worked in years. She doesn't have the credentials to. Mr. Carter. Judge Okafor's voice was level. You have counsel present. Please allow him to speak on your behalf. Gerald put a hand on DeShawn's arm. DeShawn sat. Counselor Fitch, Judge Okafor said, still looking at the documents. Your client's financial filing characterizes Mrs. Carter as having no income and no professional trajectory. It appears that characterization may require revision. Gerald stood with smooth professionalism. Your Honor, this is the first we're seeing this documentation. We'd request an opportunity to verify. You'll have that opportunity during discovery, the judge said. She looked at Renata. Mrs. Carter, do you have supporting documentation for the income you've described? Renata produced 2 more documents from her folder. Tax records, bank statements, a copy of her certification, a letter from Meridian confirming her position and compensation. All of it walked forward, reviewed, organized with a precision that Gerald Fitch, who had been practicing family law for 27 years, recognized immediately as someone who had been preparing for this moment for a long time. DeShawn was very still. Judge Okafor looked at both parties. We'll schedule the full hearing for 6 weeks from today. Both parties are required to submit complete financial disclosures. And I mean complete, Mr. Carter. Every account, every asset, every entity in which you hold any interest. If I receive anything less, I will not be pleased. She picked up her gavel. We're adjourned. The crack of the gavel cut the air. DeShawn turned to Gerald before the echo had finished. What just happened? Gerald was already gathering his documents. His voice, when he answered, was professionally controlled, but his eyes were doing something different. What just happened, he said quietly, is that your wife is not who you told me she was. And we have 6 weeks to figure out how bad that is for us. Gerald Fitch's office was on the 31st floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue, the kind of address that communicated things without saying them. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Lake Michigan in the distance. A conference table long enough to seat 12. DeShawn sat at one end of it 2 days after the first hearing, his jacket off, his tie loosened, looking like a man who had spent 2 days inside his own head and not found anything reassuring there. Gerald sat at the other end with a yellow legal pad and the controlled expression of a man managing a problem he had not been fully briefed on. Tell me everything, Gerald said. All of it. Not the version you've been telling me. Everything. DeShawn ran his hand over his face. He told Gerald about the secondary investment account, the one he had funded over 4 years with transfers from the joint account. $340,000, give or take. Gerald wrote this down without expression. He told Gerald about the LLC, Meridian Ridge Holdings, registered in Delaware, which held equity positions in 3 commercial real estate deals he had structured through contacts he'd made at Hargrove Capital. The current value was difficult to determine precisely, DeShawn said, because the deals were still active. Gerald asked for his best estimate. DeShawn said somewhere between $600,000 and $900,000, depending on market conditions. Gerald's pen stopped moving. DeShawn, he said carefully, did you disclose the LLC in your financial filing? A pause. Not specifically. Not specifically, Gerald repeated. Meaning no. I listed it as a business interest, but didn't itemize the positions. And the investment account? Another pause. It wasn't on the filing. Gerald set down his pen. He took off his reading glasses and placed them on the legal pad. He looked at DeShawn for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. You came to me 6 months ago, Gerald said, and told me your wife had no assets, no income, and no knowledge of your finances beyond what was in the joint accounts. That's what I believed. Based on what? Based on the fact that she never asked. She never showed any interest in the investment details. She handled the household. She didn't engage with the financial side of things. She just completed a certification in financial forensics, Gerald said. Silence. She's been consulting for family law firms, Gerald continued. Do you understand what that means? She has been sitting in rooms with attorneys who specialize in exactly this kind of case. She has been learning precisely how men like you hide assets. And she has had, by my count, somewhere between 2 and 3 years to prepare for this specific conversation. DeShawn stared at the table. What else? Gerald asked. What do you mean, what else? I mean, is there anything else you haven't told me? Any accounts? Any entities? Any assets? Any relationships, financial or otherwise, that she might have documentation of? The word relationships landed with a particular weight. DeShawn's jaw tightened. There may be some documentation of a personal matter. The woman at your firm. Another pause. You knew? I suspected, Gerald said. And if your wife has been documenting for 2 years, she knows too. Which means her attorney knows. Gerald stood and walked to the window. The lake was gray and flat. DeShawn, I need you to understand something. We came into this case believing we had a significant strategic advantage. A stay-at-home wife with no income, no credentials, no knowledge of your finances. That was the foundation of every motion I filed, every argument I built. That foundation no longer exists. He turned from the window. Your wife didn't just survive the separation. She used it. She built something while you were telling everyone she was falling apart. And she has had the extraordinary patience to wait until she was standing in a courtroom to show you what it was. DeShawn was quiet for a long time. So what do? We disclose, Gerald said. Everything. Now, before her forensic team finds it, because I guarantee you she has won. We file an amended disclosure and we characterize the omissions as oversights. Administrative complexity. Incomplete counsel. His tone was precise, without illusion. It won't be convincing. Judge Okafor isn't going to believe it. But it's better than being caught. If she finds that LLC before we disclose it, we're not just fighting over asset division. We're in contempt proceedings. DeShawn absorbed this. And the account. Disclose it. All of it. Tonight. All right. And DeShawn. Gerald's voice lost its professional reserve for a moment. I want you to understand something clearly. You did this. Not her. You created a situation in which your wife, a woman who gave 14 years to your household and your children and your social image, had no choice but to treat her own marriage like a litigation strategy just to protect herself. Whatever happens next, that is the architecture you built. DeShawn said nothing. He picked up his jacket and left. On the other side of the city, in Patricia Osei's conference room on the 20th floor of an office building in the West Loop, Renata sat across the table from Bernard Achebe, who had spent the prior 3 weeks doing what he did best. The table in front of him was covered in printed spreadsheets, transaction logs, and corporate registration documents. There was a legal pad filled with notes in his precise, small handwriting. "Tell me the good news first," Renata said. Bernard didn't smile, but something in his expression softened slightly. "The good news is that your instincts were correct on all 3 points. The secondary investment account exists. It's currently valued at $347,000. He's been making regular transfers from the joint account since year 3 of your marriage. Small amounts, recurring, consistent with routine household transfers, so they wouldn't read as unusual on a casual review." Patricia was writing. "What else?" "The LLC, Meridian Ridge Holdings. 3 active equity positions in commercial development deals in the Chicago metro area. 2 in the suburbs. 1 in the city. Current estimated value, based on public records and the deal terms I've been able to reconstruct, is $820,000. It was not disclosed in his financial filing." Renata looked at Patricia. Patricia's expression remained composed, but her pen moved faster. "And the third thing," Bernard continued, "is the one that took me longer to find. There's a trust." He pulled a document to the top of the stack. "A revocable living trust established 4 years ago, registered in Illinois, under the name of DeShawn's mother, Vivian Carter. The assets in the trust include a portfolio of municipal bonds and a partial interest in a commercial property in Evanston. The total value is approximately $290,000. Now, his mother is still living, so technically these are her assets, and he would argue he has no claim to them. But," Bernard paused, "the funding source for the trust was a series of transfers from an account that was held jointly during your marriage. He used marital funds to create a trust in his mother's name." The room was quiet. "He moved marital money into his mother's trust," Patricia said, "over a period of 18 months, approximately 4 years ago. The total transferred was $180,000. Patricia set down her pen. She looked at Renata. "That's not asset concealment. That's fraudulent transfer. That's a different category of problem." Renata was very still. She thought about Vivian Carter, who had embraced her warmly at the wedding and cried at both of the children's births, who sent Zora and Marcus cards on every holiday without fail, who had no idea, Renata suspected, that the security she was living on had been built with money that wasn't only DeShawn's to give. "Can we prove he controlled those transfers?" Renata asked. "The IP addresses for the online transfers," Bernard said, "traced to the home address in Lincoln Park and to a workstation registered to DeShawn at Hargrove Capital." Patricia nodded slowly. "We file a motion identifying the fraudulent transfer and requesting the court treat those funds as marital assets for the purposes of division." She looked at Renata. "This is going to get complicated. It may involve DeShawn's mother in a way that gets uncomfortable." "I know," Renata said. "Are you prepared for that?" Renata thought about the pull-out couch she had slept on at her friend Camille's apartment for 6 weeks while she waited for her security deposit to clear. She thought about telling Zora over the phone that Mommy was living somewhere else for a little while and that everything was fine, her voice steady even as her hands shook. She thought about Marcus asking her, the first night she had him in the Bronzeville apartment, whether she was sad, and her telling him that she was fine, that she was working things out, that he didn't need to worry. "I'm prepared," she said. Patricia reached for her phone. "I'm going to call Bernard back in, and we're going to spend the next 3 hours preparing our disclosure filing. We want everything documented and filed before DeShawn's team has a chance to get ahead of this." It was after 9 o'clock when Renata finally left Patricia's office. She stood on the sidewalk outside the West Loop building for a moment, her breath visible in the winter air. The city moved around her in its usual indifferent rhythm. Traffic, pedestrians, the distant sound of a train on the elevated track. She pulled out her phone and sent a text to her sister Delphine, who had been waiting for an update since morning. She typed, "We found the trust. It's worse than we thought and better than we needed." Delphine replied in seconds. "What does Patricia say?" Renata typed, "She says we're ready." She put her phone in her coat pocket and walked toward the parking garage. In 2 weeks, they would be back in court. And this time, What she placed on the table would not be a folder. It would be a reckoning. The amended financial disclosure from Gerald Fitch arrived via email at Patricia's office at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 days before the scheduled interim hearing. Patricia forwarded it to Renata with a single line. He blinked. Renata opened the attachment at her kitchen table, Zora and Marcus asleep in the next room, the apartment quiet except for the sound of Chicago traffic 2 floors below. She read through it carefully. The secondary investment account was now listed. The LLC was now listed. Both characterized in an accompanying letter as assets previously omitted due to the complexity of ongoing investment structures and the inadvertent miscommunication of same to counsel. The trust was not listed. Renata forwarded the disclosure to Bernard with a note. He disclosed the accounts and the LLC. He did not disclose the trust. Bernard replied at 6:14 the following morning. I know. That's the one he thinks we haven't found. Patricia filed their response at 9 a.m. Friday, attaching Bernard's full forensic report, including documentation of the trust, the fraudulent transfer, and the IP address logs tying DeShawn to every transaction. She filed simultaneously a motion for sanctions, arguing that DeShawn's partial disclosure, which came only after Renata had engaged a forensic accountant, constituted bad faith concealment of marital assets. She requested the court impose financial penalties and order a court-supervised audit at DeShawn's expense. By noon, Gerald Fitch had called Patricia's office 4 times. Patricia returned none of the calls. The interim hearing was held on a Friday morning. Judge Okafor had cleared her docket for 2 hours, which was, Patricia told Renata, an indication that she had already read the filings and understood what she was looking at. The courtroom was fuller this time. Word had traveled, in the quiet way that word travels in legal circles, that the Carter divorce had become something other than a standard high-asset case. Gerald Fitch arrived with a second attorney, a younger woman from his firm who carried an additional briefcase. This was a signal, Patricia told Renata. They were preparing for the motion hearing to run long. DeShawn arrived in the Tom Ford suit this time. He looked like a man who had decided that looking like he was in control was the closest he could get to actually being in control. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they met Renata's briefly as he took his seat, held something she had not expected. Not anger, not contempt, something more like recognition, as though he were seeing her, for the first time, as she actually was. She looked away. There was nothing to say to that look. Not here. Judge Okafor entered precisely on time. She did not take her seat immediately. She stood at the bench for a moment, reviewing something in the file before her, then sat with the deliberate economy of someone conserving her energy for what came next. We're here on Mrs. Carter's motion for sanctions, she said, and on the matter of the amended financial disclosure filed by Mr. Carter's counsel on Thursday evening. She looked at Gerald. Counselor Fitch, your client's original financial filing omitted a secondary investment account valued at approximately $347,000 and an LLC holding equity positions valued at over $800,000. How do you explain that? Gerald rose with practiced steadiness. Your Honor, the omissions were the result of an administrative oversight in the compilation of the initial disclosure. The complexity of ongoing investment structures led to a miscommunication between my client and my office, and we moved to correct the record as soon as this was brought to our attention. It was brought to your attention, Judge Okafor said, by Mrs. Carter's forensic accountant. We became aware of certain questions being raised. Counselor, the judge's voice didn't rise, but it became very precise, like a blade finding its edge. Your client filed a motion requesting primary custody of his children on the grounds that his wife had no financial stability. He simultaneously omitted over $1 million in assets from his own financial disclosure. I want you to look at those two facts together and explain to me how either of them was accidental. The courtroom was very quiet. Gerald said, Your Honor, my client maintains. I've read what your client maintains, Judge Okafor said. Let me tell you what I'm seeing. She picked up a document. Your client's original financial disclosure listed a primary investment account, a retirement fund, and his compensation at Hargrove Capital. That's it. In the world your client described to this court, he had no LLC. He had no secondary investment account. He had nothing that would suggest he was doing anything other than paying the mortgage and putting money away for retirement. She set down the document. Now I have a forensic report telling me he also moved $180,000 in marital funds into a trust registered in his mother's name, which, notably, is not in the amended disclosure he filed Thursday night. A sound moved through the gallery. Gerald's second attorney wrote something quickly and slid it across the table to him. Gerald read it, absorbed it, and looked up. Your Honor, the trust Your Honor is referring to is held by Mr. Carter's mother and consists of personal assets, funded with marital money, Patricia said, rising. Your Honor, Patricia Osei for the petitioner. We have documentation showing the trust was funded through a series of transfers originating from accounts that were held jointly during the marriage. The IP address logs confirm that my client's husband initiated those transfers personally from both his home and his office. She walked a stack of documents to the bailiff. I'm submitting Bernard Achebe's full forensic report as evidence and requesting the court treat the trust funding as a fraudulent transfer of marital assets. The documents made their way to Judge Okafor. She reviewed them in silence for what felt like a very long time. DeShawn sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him, a stillness that Renata recognized. He was doing what he always did when he was calculating. He was inside his own head, running the numbers, looking for the move. She wondered, watching him, if he was finding one. She suspected he wasn't. Judge Okafor set down the report. She looked at DeShawn directly, something she had not done with particular focus until this moment. Mr. Carter, she said, you are a senior finance professional. You manage investment portfolios and equity structures for a living. I need you to help me understand how a man with your professional expertise accidentally omits over $1 million in assets from a court-ordered financial disclosure. DeShawn's attorney touched his arm. DeShawn looked at the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice controlled. I take full responsibility for the omissions. I should have been more thorough in communicating the scope of my financial interests to counsel. It was not my intention to mislead the court. And the trust. A pause that lasted precisely 1 second too long. The trust is my mother's. Funded with your money. Funded with a gift I made to my mother, yes. During your marriage, Judge Okafor said. With money that was held in accounts you shared with your wife. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench. Mr. Carter, I've been on this bench for 16 years. I want to be very direct with you, because I think you are a man who respects directness. What you have described to me as a gift to your mother, funded during your marriage without your wife's knowledge or consent, is what this court considers a fraudulent transfer of marital assets. It doesn't matter whose name is on the trust. It matters where the money came from and who made the decision to move it. DeShawn was still. I'm granting the motion for sanctions, Judge Okafor said. Mr. Carter will pay Mrs. Carter's legal costs incurred in the forensic investigation. I'll set the amount after reviewing the cost documentation. I'm ordering a full court-supervised audit of all financial interests held by Mr. Carter, including Meridian Ridge Holdings, the trust, and any other entities identified by the auditor. The audit will be conducted at Mr. Carter's expense. She looked at both tables. The final hearing will take place in 3 weeks. Both parties will receive the auditor's report 48 hours before that date. I expect everyone to arrive at that hearing ready to conclude this matter. She picked up her gavel. And Mr. Carter. Her voice was the same volume it had been throughout, but something in it settled into a different register. Not anger exactly, but gravity. The weight of a conclusion being drawn. The woman sitting across the aisle from you spent 14 years running a household that made your career possible. She raised your children. She supported the life you built. And when your marriage ended, she did not fall apart. She got to work. She learned. She built something. She walked into this courtroom prepared. A pause. You should have paid closer attention. The gavel fell. The final hearing was on a Wednesday. March. Chicago winter still not finished, but with that edge in the air that suggests winter is losing the argument. Renata parked in the Daily Center garage and sat in her vehicle for 3 minutes before going in. Not because she was afraid, because she wanted to feel this moment clearly before it became something that had already happened. 3 years. 2 years of watching and documenting before the filing. 1 year of legal proceedings. And before all of that, 14 years of a marriage that had been, for a long time, genuinely something. She wanted to honor the weight of it, even here, even now. She didn't believe in performing grief she didn't feel, but she also didn't believe in pretending something that had cost this much had cost nothing. She got out of the car and walked toward the elevator. Patricia and Bernard were already in the conference room outside Courtroom 7 when Renata arrived. The audit report had come in 2 days earlier. Bernard had walked her through it with the focused, methodical care he brought to everything. And when he finished, she had sat very still for a moment before asking one question. Is it all there? Bernard had said, all of it. The final accounting, after the court-supervised audit, was this. DeShawn Carter held marital assets totaling approximately $3.2 million. The Lincoln Park home, the primary investment and retirement accounts, the secondary investment account, the LLC equity positions, and the $180,000 in trust-transferred funds, which the court had ordered characterized as marital property. His salary at Hargrove Capital, his bonus structure, and his equity stake in the firm's own holdings added significant additional income. The picture that emerged was not of a man who had been protecting his legitimate earnings. It was of a man who had spent years systematically moving money into places he believed his wife would never look, sustained by the assumption that she didn't know enough to find it. He had been wrong about that for at least 3 years. The courtroom was the fullest it had been. DeShawn's mother sat in the gallery, her expression unreadable. Renata's mother sat beside Delphine in the front row, Delphine's hand over hers. Several colleagues from Patricia's network. A journalist from a local legal affairs publication who had heard about the forensic trust findings. The public benches held the particular energy of people who know they are watching something that matters. DeShawn arrived with Gerald and the second attorney and a third face Renata didn't recognize, someone from Hargrove Capital's legal department, she suspected, there to observe what implications the proceedings might have for the firm. DeShawn's posture was different from the first hearing. The studied confidence was gone. What remained was something more honest, and therefore somehow harder to look at. A man who understood his situation and had accepted, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, that understanding it was all he had left. Judge Okafor entered. The room stood and settled. Let's conclude this, she said. She had reviewed the audit report. She had reviewed the final asset disclosures, the sanctions documentation, the trust findings, the forensic report in its entirety. She had also received, Renata knew, character statements from both parties' networks, neighbors, family members, professional contacts. What those statements said about DeShawn, particularly from people who had witnessed his behavior during the separation, Patricia had shared with Renata in general terms without dwelling on the specifics. Renata hadn't needed the details. She had lived the original version. Judge Okafor spoke for 11 minutes. Renata sat with her hands folded and listened to all of it. Joint legal custody. Both parents retained the right to participate in major decisions regarding Zora and Marcus. Physical custody, 60-40 in Renata's favor. Primary residence with their mother, alternate weekends, and a weekday evening with their father. Renata had asked for this arrangement specifically because she believed, despite everything, that her children needed their father in their lives. DeShawn's attorney had argued for 50-50. The judge, citing the pattern of behavior throughout the proceedings and the documented attempts to characterize Renata as unstable and destitute, while simultaneously concealing nearly $1 million in assets, had found in Renata's favor. Asset division: 65% to Renata across all marital assets, including the trust funds, which the court had ordered returned to the marital estate. The Lincoln Park home would be sold, proceeds divided accordingly. Spousal support: $5,000 per month for 5 years, plus child support calculated by state guidelines. All marital debt assumed by DeShawn. The sanctions from the interim hearing, now finalized: $68,000, covering the cost of Bernard's forensic work and a portion of Patricia's legal fees. When Judge Okafor finished, she looked at both parties for a moment without speaking. Then she said something Renata had not expected. She said, "I want to say one thing that is not a legal ruling and is therefore perhaps outside my role to say. But I've been doing this work for 16 years, and this case has stayed with me in a way that not all of them do." She looked at Renata. "Mrs. Carter, you came into this courtroom 3 months ago representing yourself, and you placed a folder on that table that represented years of work and patience and self-discipline under circumstances that would have broken many people. Whatever you do next, I hope you carry that knowledge with you." She picked up her gavel. "This case is concluded." The sound of it was different from the other times. Final in a way that settled through the room like something physical. Renata didn't move for a moment. Patricia touched her shoulder. Delphine's voice came from the gallery. Not words, just a sound that her sister had been making since they were children when something important happened. A small, involuntary expression of feeling that Renata recognized before she consciously heard it. Her mother was crying. The quiet kind of crying that comes when relief and sorrow occupy the same moment. Renata stood. She gathered her folder. That same navy folder, a little worn now at the corners from 3 months of courtrooms and conference rooms and late nights at the kitchen table, and she held it for a moment before placing it in her bag. DeShawn was across the aisle. He stood slowly. Gerald was speaking quietly to him about next steps. The Hargrove Capital attorney was already on his phone. DeShawn's mother rose from the gallery and made her way toward her son, her face carrying something complicated: love and confusion and the beginning of a grief that had nothing to do with money. DeShawn looked at Renata. Just once, briefly, before his mother reached him. She met his eyes. There was nothing to perform in that moment, no point to make. She had already made every point she needed to make, in documents and disclosures and courtroom testimony, and 3 years of quiet, determined work. What was in his eyes she would think about later, on her own time, in the privacy of her own processing. For now, she simply looked at him, and then she looked away. She walked out into the hallway. Patricia beside her. Delphine, who had slipped past the gallery railing, took her hand. Her mother appeared on her other side and said her name once, low and full, and Renata stopped walking and let herself be held for a moment. She thought about the night she had found the messages on DeShawn's phone, the cup of tea she had made herself, the window, the backyard, the children coming home in 4 hours, the deliberate, self-preserving stillness of that moment. She thought about Delphine's voice saying, "Don't move yet." She thought about every document she had photographed, every late night with the coursework on her personal laptop, every conversation with Patricia over the prior 2 years, building the case piece by piece, knowing that the moment would come, but not being certain, not being able to be certain, only being able to prepare. She thought about Zora's voice on the phone asking whether Mommy was sad, about Marcus and his Legos on the low shelf in the Bronzeville apartment, about what she would tell them when they were older about this year. Not the legal strategy, not the forensic details, just the simple thing at the center of it, that when someone tries to tell you who you are allowed to disagree. That disagreeing is sometimes a quiet, years-long act of documentation and self-education and patience, and that it is still disagreeing. That the truth of what you are worth cannot be frozen or changed or taken in the night, because it doesn't live in a joint account. It lives in you, and no filing can touch it. In the hallway of the Daily Center, with Chicago visible through the tall windows and her sister's hand in hers, Renata Monroe Carter, who had been told she was nothing, who had been photographed leaving her own home with 2 bags and a folder, who had slept on a pull-out couch and lived on discipline and rebuilt herself one document at a time, exhaled. Her phone buzzed. A text from Zora. "Mom. Dad said the judge made a decision. Are you okay?" Renata typed back carefully, the way she had learned to type to her daughter over the past year. Honest without loading, clear without overwhelming. "I'm okay, baby. Better than okay. I'll pick you and Marcus up at 5. I'll explain everything." She paused, then added, "I love you. Both of you. So much." Zora's reply came in seconds. A single line. "We know, Mom. We know." Renata put her phone in her coat pocket. She looked at Delphine. Delphine smiled. Outside the Daily Center, the city went on in its usual way. Indifferent, moving, enormous, and entirely unconcerned with one woman's specific gravity. But Renata stood on the steps in the cold March air and felt it anyway. The particular quality of a burden that has been carried so long it has become invisible until the moment it is finally, fully set down. She stood there for 30 seconds, feeling it, naming it to herself. Then she walked down the steps and went to get her children. There is something about Renata's story that goes beyond a courtroom, beyond a divorce, beyond the legal specifics of asset division and forensic accounting. What Renata did, and what took 3 years of quiet, patient, disciplined work, was refuse to accept someone else's definition of her. She had been told she was nothing without him. She had been told she had no value, no trajectory, no future that didn't depend on his goodwill. And instead of arguing with that, instead of reacting to it, she did something more powerful. She documented it. She educated herself. She built evidence. She waited. And when the moment came, she walked into a room and put a folder on a table, and the folder said everything she had never needed to shout. If Renata's story resonated with you, if you've ever been told you were less than you knew yourself to be, if you've ever had to rebuild from a place someone else made for you, or if you simply believe that accountability matters and that the truth has a way of finding the surface, drop a comment below and tell me what hit you hardest. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, a friend going through something difficult, a sister who's been told she's not enough, share this video with them. These stories travel because they need to. They reach the people who need them exactly when they need them. Until next time, remember, you are not what someone else's fear made you out to be. And the work you do in silence will speak for itself, eventually, in every room that matters.